Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Friday, January 7th. On Fridays, Dan Deitrich outside of South Bend, Indiana, and Doug Pagitt outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, hunkered away trying to bring about some common good, talk about economics on one Friday and science on the other Fridays. And today is an economics day. But before you say to yourself, oh no, I'm going to get bored with economics. Oh, I promise you, this will be... This will be mind-opening. We spent a lot of time, Dan, talking about how our economy works, especially with the role of the federal government and how the economy works at the federal government level, and what about deficits and all. One of the people who's given a lot of thought to that and is one of the leading advocates of this is somebody whose name is Stephanie Kelton, and she has a book called The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. That's what she calls it. The first chapter of this book is this beautifully succinct telling, and we're going to play that for you today. I want you to hear it. But go buy this book. You really should have it. I have it on Audible. I use it when I run, ride, walk, this kind of thing. It's just it's so incredibly helpful. And if you think that you don't understand what goes on in our federal government and why people are doing what they're doing and why Joe Manchin is saying what he's saying and then why Republicans say what they say and then why Bernie Sanders says what he says, Stephanie Kelton really helps all this stuff come together. But the first thing you have to do in any economics conversation around these ideas is to remove some myths that exist. And so in the opening chapter of this book, what she argues is that using the metaphor of a household budget is not only not helpful, it's inaccurate and wrong when it comes to the federal government. In fact, she goes on to say it's exactly the opposite. We'll be explaining this. See, so one of the things we've been talking about around economics is, does the government have to take money from its citizens to spend its own money? This is the heart of it all, right? I mean, this is taxes and all the rest. And what a deficit, that a deficit is somehow borrowing or spending over our means. She gets into all of this, takes it apart, tears it apart. And part of the reason I was super attracted to it is I've written a number of books, the number's 10. And I have a couple of favorite lines in some of those books. And one of them is a quote from Sesame Street. One of these is not like the other. And another one is a quote from who's that folksy writer and satirist from the late 1800s or the 1900s. The guy with the mustache.
Yeah, the Colonel Sanders looking dude.
Yeah,
Tom Sawyer.
Yeah, that guy.
Yeah.
Here's this great line. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. It's a great folksy line. She uses both of those quotes that I've used in two different books in this one chapter. So they both come up. And I really felt this kinship to her. I love the ideas and all the rest of it, but it's like, oh, this is really great. So I bring all that up to say, like, look, she starts with Sesame Street. She refers to, folksy little statements. It's very understandable. So don't pull away if you're thinking, I don't want to hear about modern monetary theory. You're going to love this. It's really going to be great. We're going to make some interjections as we go to, sort of give your mind a break and pepper it up a little bit. And so we're going to talk a little modern monetary theory by listening to Stephanie Kelton talk about it, and then we're going to start talking about it.
Yeah. I'll just say the shift away from the household budget metaphor for the federal government is so big. Once you get past that, it's like, oh, a lot of this other stuff makes more sense. And the way we run the federal government makes less sense.
Yes.
The way we limit ourselves and complain over certain things. For
sure. And look, and she's not an outsider to the government. She raises in this chapter that in 2015, her job was the economist for the Democrats in the Senate. She was hired by Bernie Sanders. And she expresses her frustration that even though she's in that role, the people in the Senate making decisions about this don't understand properly how the government works. And she has this great analogy about the difference between the user side of a system, which is all of us, and the supplier side, which is the federal government, not the state government, local governments, county governments. They all use the same money, but the federal government produces the money. The big mind bender, which we'll probably take a break just to let your mind rest in case these are new ideas to you, is your tax dollars don't go anywhere. When you pay your taxes, the money is just removed from the system. When you pay your taxes to the federal government, federal government doesn't take it, put it in a bank account, and recycle it. They use taxes to remove money from the economy. They put money in when they make it and print it or move digits on a computer. They create the money. They speak it into being. It's like Genesis 1. That's how the federal government works. And then when they take money away from you in taxes, it just goes away. You don't pay anyone's government salaries. You don't pay for the military. You don't pay for anything. The government pays for all that. And the money that you pay in taxes comes out of the system so we don't get too much money in the system, which would cause inflation. Boom. Mind blowing. It doesn't mean they don't have to manage budgets because they're always looking at inflation. She'll get into that. So, all right, she's better at this than we are.
Yeah,
but
my brain already hurts, and I feel like my whole life is a lie, but I'm excited to learn.
It's actually going to therapy, right? With your family. It's like doing deep family therapy. Like, what? And she even says that. So just to sort of, clue your mind in on what you're about to hear. She even says when she first heard these ideas, she was studying as a doctoral student to be an economist. And she was like, this can't be true. And she's like, it's true. And some of it's been made more true since 1971, when the U.S. economy moved away from the gold standard under Richard Nixon to the full credit of the federal government. It's a big shift. So, all right, here we go. This is Stephanie Kelton. She's going to start out telling you about Sesame Street, and I think you're going to love it.
Don't think of a household. All across America, families are tightening their belts and making hard decisions. The federal government should do the same. President Obama, State of the Union Address, 2010. Myth number 1. The federal government should budget like a household. Reality. Unlike a household, the federal government issues the currency it spends. Like many of you, I grew up watching the television show Sesame Street. One of the skills it helped young kids develop was the ability to sort objects according to their similarities and differences. One of these things is not like the other, the song began as this segment of the show started. 4 images appeared in a matrix on the screen: a banana, an orange, a pineapple, and a sandwich. The sandwich, my sister and I would holler back at the TV set. I'm no longer a kid, but I still find myself hollering back at the TV whenever I hear someone talk about the federal government's budget as if it were no different from a household budget. If you've heard someone complain that Washington needs to get its fiscal house in order, you've heard a version of the household myth. It derives from the flawed idea that we should look at Uncle Sam's budget through the same lens we use to manage our own family budgets. Of all of the myths that we're going to explore in the chapters ahead, this is undoubtedly the most pernicious. It's a favorite among politicians who tend to look for the simplest possible rhetoric to connect with their constituents, and what could be easier than describing the government's finances in terms the rest of us already understand, our own. We all know it's important to keep our personal spending in line with our overall income. So when we hear someone come along and talk about government finances in ways that remind us of our own, it hits home. It's got a folksy kitchen table feel to it. We've all seen it done. In campaign ads and town halls across America, politicians point to the small businessman or the hardworking waitress, holding them up as shining examples of what responsible budgeting looks like. They empathize with the struggles of everyday Americans, reminding us that we all know what it's like to sit around the kitchen table and balance the family checkbook. Then, in the hope of drawing outrage from the crowd, they shift the conversation to the federal government, telling us that Uncle Sam's books almost never balance because irresponsible spending has become a way of life in Washington, D.C. Stories like these resonate with us because the language is so familiar. We know that we're supposed to live within our means and arrange our finances so that we aren't spending more than we bring in. We know we need to set aside some savings for the future, and that we should be extra careful when it comes to borrowing money. Taking on too much debt can lead to bankruptcy, foreclosure, and even incarceration. We know people can go broke, and we've seen iconic companies like Radio Shack and Toys R Us get driven into bankruptcy when they could no longer afford to pay the bills. Even cities, like Detroit, and states, like Kansas, can run into big trouble when they're not bringing in enough money to cover their expenses. Every family sitting around the kitchen table understands these realities. What they don't understand is why the federal government, Uncle Sam, is different. To understand why, we go right to the heart of MMT. Issuers versus users of currency. MMT takes as its starting point a simple and incontrovertible fact. Our national currency, the US dollar, comes from the US government, and it
So this little point she's about to make, this difference between users and providers, this is so essential. So if you're sort of finding your rhythm to her presentation, focus in on this one for a second, because this is really gonna grab you.
can't come from anywhere else, at least not legally. Both the U.S. Treasury and its fiscal agent, the Federal Reserve, have the authority to issue the U.S. dollar. This might involve minting the coins in your pocket, printing up the bills in your wallet, or creating digital dollars known as reserves that exist only as electronic entries on bank balance sheets. The Treasury manufactures the coins, and the Federal Reserve creates the rest. Once you appreciate the significance of this reality, you will be able to unravel many of the deficit myths on your own. Even though you may not have given it much thought before, something inside you probably already understands this basic truth. I mean, think about it. Can you create US dollars? Sure, you can earn them, but can you manufacture them? Maybe with high-tech engraving equipment, you could set up shop in your basement and produce something that looks very much like the US dollar. Or maybe you could hack into the computer at the Federal Reserve and type up some digital dollars. But we both know you'll end up in an orange jumpsuit if you get caught trying to counterfeit the currency. That's because the U.S. Constitution grants the federal government the exclusive right to issue the currency. As the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis put it, the U.S. government is the sole manufacturer of dollars. The term monopoly refers, of course, to a market in which there is only one supplier of some product. Since the federal government is the sole manufacturer of US dollars, we can think of it as having a monopoly over the dollar itself. It's kind of like being given a super copyright, one that never expires, over the ability to make additional copies of the dollar. It's an exclusive power articulated by our founders. It's not something households, businesses, or state and local governments can do. Only the federal government can issue our currency. Everyone else is merely a currency user. It's a special power that must be exercised with great care. Going back to Sesame Street, we can easily identify which of the things in Exhibit 1 in the accompanying PDF is not like the others. The distinction between currency users and the currency issuer lies at the heart of MMT. And as we will see in the sections ahead, it has profound implications for some of the most important policy debates of our time, such as healthcare, climate change, Social Security, international trade, and inequality. To take full advantage of the special powers that accrue to the currency issuer, countries need to do more than just grant themselves the exclusive right to issue the currency. It's also important that they don't promise to convert their currency into something they could run out of, for example, gold or some other country's currency. And they need to refrain from borrowing, that is, taking on debt in a currency that isn't their own. When a country issues its own non-convertible fiat currency and only borrows in its own currency, that country has attained monetary sovereignty. Countries with monetary sovereignty, then, don't have to manage their budgets as a household would. They can use their currency issuing capacity to pursue policies aimed at maintaining a full employment economy. Sometimes people ask me whether MMT applies to countries outside the United States. It does. Even though the US dollar is considered special because of its status as the global reserve currency, lots of other countries have the power to make their monetary systems work for their people. So if you're listening to this audiobook outside the USA, don't assume that there are no important lessons here for you and your country. On the contrary, MMT can be used to describe and improve the policy choices available to any country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty. The US, Japan, the UK, Australia, Canada, and many more. And as we'll see in Chapter 5, MMT also offers insights for countries with little or no monetary sovereignty, nations like Panama, Tunisia, Greece, Venezuela, and many more. M&T helps us to see why countries that fix their exchange rates, like Argentina did until 2001, or who take on debt denominated in a foreign currency, like Venezuela has done, undermine their monetary sovereignty and subject themselves to the kinds of constraints faced by other currency users, such as Italy, Greece, and other Eurozone countries. When countries with little or no monetary sovereignty fail to prioritize budget discipline, they can face unsustainable debts just like a household. In contrast, the United States never has to worry about running out of money. It can always pay the bills, even the big ones. The US can't end up like Greece, which gave up its monetary sovereignty when it stopped issuing the drachma in order to use the euro. America is not dependent on China or anyone else for financing. Most importantly, having monetary sovereignty means that a country can prioritize the security and well-being of its people without needing to worry about how to pay for it. Thatcher's backward dictum. Tabs. T-A-B followed by S. In a now famous speech from 1983, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared that the state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can only do so by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. This was Thatcher's way of saying that the government's finances were constrained in the same way our personal finances are constrained. In order to spend more, the government would need to raise the money. We know that there is no such thing as public money, she added. There is only taxpayer money. If the British people wanted more from their government, they would have to foot the bill. Was it an innocent mistake or a carefully crafted statement designed to discourage the British people from demanding more from their government? I'm not sure. Regardless of her motives, Thatcher's remarks concealed the currency-issuing power of the state. More than 3 decades later, political leaders in currency-issuing nations like the UK and the US still talk as though we, the taxpayers, are the ultimate source of the government's money. As former British Prime Minister Theresa May put it more recently, the government doesn't have a magic money tree. Unless they take...
So this is the essential argument she's trying to debunk, that the money the government has, it gets from taxes, gets from its people. And I think she's doing a nice job, but just to sort of focus in on that for a minute. Not only do most all of us believe it, that's what Barack Obama said. She quotes him at the beginning and in the introduction to the book. Is actually a long bit of what Barack Obama said, that all politicians talk like this. And it's a little unclear if people know that that's not how it works, that the government moves the money, that creates the money that it moves around.
Or if they know that's how it works and they want to continue to use it as a political tool.
Yeah, she's going to get into the one of the people she worked with in Congress, a Republican, worked previously in his own business that was a shoe sales business and had accounts receivable and bank accounts and money going out and had to balance his business budget, and then worked for the state of Wyoming, where they also had a mandate to balance the budget because states have to do this. So he took those two ideas and brought them into the federal government and didn't want to or didn't understand that the federal government isn't like that because it has the Federal Reserve that produces the money. So it's a different entity than all the others. This is the essential piece that we just have to get our heads around, that the federal system is different. And economists not all economists even agree with this, which is really baffling. And she gets into that a bit about, like, how could you be an economist and not literally know this is the case? What I think goes on, though, is that some people ultimately say, okay, I grant to you the government can, but because we're limited by inflation and other issues, functionally, it's the same thing as if we have limits. So it doesn't really matter because you can't just go off and do it. So it's a difference without a distinction kind of argument. But to get your own head around it, if you talk to a friend or family member and say, we have to have a different relationship with federal dollars as we talk about how we should invest in our country, how we should deploy money, where money should go, whether we should do Build Back Better Act or all the rest of this, This is essentially where it comes from. And every time Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema or anyone else says, how are we going to pay for it? Or Nancy Pelosi, who puts into the House of Representatives the requirement called pay as you go, that they cannot and will not approve any bill that doesn't have an offset of taxes or spending to the spending. So it's happening all over our government, and people like Stephanie Kelton are pulling their hair out saying, we should stop doing this because it's harming people. Like, I think it's really great. She's going to get to this in a minute. She's not saying this because she's just being a wonk. She's saying we have to really think differently about how we spend dollars on all this. So,
yeah.
Should we just keep going?
Keep rolling.
Right.
Of our money, we're told, the government can't afford to top up spending on existing programs, much less fund ambitious new projects. Most of us, the idea that the government must tax more to spend more probably sounds reasonable, and our politicians know it. They also know that most of us don't want to see our taxes go up, so they twist themselves into knots trying to figure out how to win votes by vowing to do big things without asking the majority of us to pay more. For example, Donald Trump promised the American people that Mexico would pay for his border wall, while Democrats have insisted that billionaires and Wall Street banks can foot the bill for many of their ambitious programs. The money has to come from somewhere, right? Actually, we've got it backward. But before we get to that, let's walk through the conventional understanding so it will be easier to contrast this backward thinking with the way things actually work. Recall that the finances we understand best are our own, and we know that we need to come up with money before we can spend. So the idea that the federal government must collect funds in order to spend seems intuitively correct. Extrapolating from our own experiences, we know that we can't walk out of the department store with a new pair of shoes or drive away from the car dealership in a sporty new vehicle unless we come up with the financing first. According to conventional thinking, the government relies on two sources of funding. It can raise your taxes or it can borrow your savings. Taxes allow the government to collect money from people who have it, which means taxes are looked upon as a way to transfer money to the federal government. If the government wants to spend more than it collects by taxing, it can raise additional funds by borrowing from savers. In either case, the idea is that the government must come up with the money before it can spend. That's how most of us have been taught to understand the government's fiscal operations. Taxing and borrowing come first. Spending comes last. A handy mnemonic for the conventional way of thinking is TABS. Taxing and borrowing precede spending. Because we've been trained to believe that, like each of us, the government must find the money before it can spend, everyone becomes obsessed with the question, how are you going to pay for it? We've been conditioned to expect our elected officials to offer a blueprint that maps out the source of every new dollar they wish to spend. Even the most progressive candidates fear that they'll be eaten alive if their proposals add to the deficit, so borrowing is almost never an option. To show that their policies won't add to the deficit, they hunt for ways to squeeze more tax revenue out of the economy, usually targeting those who can most easily afford to pay more. For example, Senator Bernie Sanders insists that a financial transactions tax will cover the cost of making public colleges and universities tuition-free, and Senator Elizabeth Warren claims that a 2% tax on fortunes above $50 million would raise enough revenue to wipe out student debt for 95% of students and also pay for universal childcare and free college. In both cases, the goal is to demonstrate that everything can be paid for by taxing the richest people in America. As we'll see in the chapters ahead, there's often room to fund new programs without the need for higher taxes. Adding to the deficit shouldn't be looked upon as taboo. Taxes are critically important, but there's no reason to assume the government must raise taxes whenever it wants to invest in our economy. In practice, the federal government almost never collects enough taxes to offset all of its spending. Deficit spending is the norm, and everyone in Washington, D.C. knows it. And so do voters. That's why so many politicians complain that Congress needs to get its fiscal house in order before it's too late. To demonstrate their commitment to good old-fashioned household budgeting, the Democrats, led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, reinstated a budget rule known as PAYGO in 2018. With PAYGO in place, borrowing to finance new expenditures is technically off limits. That reduces the TABS model to just tax and spend, so lawmakers face intense pressure to cover any proposed new spending with revenue from new taxes. Is this a good political strategy? Is it good economics? It certainly sounds like a wholesome approach to budgeting, but it's rooted in a flawed understanding of how the federal government actually spends. In fact, it gets everything backward. How the currency issuer spends. STAB, spending before taxing and borrowing. Because it's the
This again is really essential when she says how the currency provider spends. Really, it's like this little piece that you just have to sort of grasp as being different. Your state government's not like this. Nothing else is like it. Only this one entity functions like this. So spending before taxing is how it actually works. You don't tax first and then wait for the money to come in. And she explains this here in a minute. But this idea that our federal government is going to function in a way that's unique because its unique role is something that I've talked to, I don't know, hundreds of people about this, I think now. I keep bringing it up. And over, the thing that finally clicks for someone is when they understand the significance of the federal government's having the treasury that produces the money. We really don't believe that's how it works. This is the fundamental, I think, glitch in many of our thinking. We really do think that it's the same, that the money already exists and is being cycled through the system. Not that the federal government takes money out by taxes, makes it disappear, and puts new money in through spending, and that's how money goes. We just don't believe that that's what goes on. Like when you say to someone, and I've done it, Dan, I don't know if you've tried to talk to others about this, but when you say to people, when you write a check to the federal government, they take it out of your bank account and then it goes away. People literally look at me and say, like, but where does it go? I'm like, it just goes away. And they're like, I don't get it. And then she has this great analogy. She says, in a basketball game, when somebody shoots a 3-pointer and they put 3 points up on the scoreboard, where did that come from? There aren't points sitting around that the scorekeeper produces them, right? Puts them up on the board. And then if the referee says, oh, his foot was on the line, that was not 3 points, that was 2 points, they take a point away. Where does the point go? It doesn't go into a bucket of points. So that's what gets confusing because we think of dollars and coins.
Yeah.
So we know that you're producing dollars and you're producing coins, even though we use all of our bank accounts, and it's actually the banking system where all this ultimately goes. A dollar bill and a coin is just a certified IOU. If you look on it, it even says that's what it is. It's a promissory note. So all that is a reference to a data point inside of a computer somewhere. This is the big mind bender that you have to get to about the federal government.
Yeah, you got to get away from the Fort Knox pile of money that we take some out, put some back in. That's how much we have to spend.
That's right. And look, we shouldn't be to blame on this. For those of us who remember Fort Knox, or maybe it's because, the Oak Ridge Boys saying all the gold in California is in a bank in California in somebody else's name, that old song. If you know that song, it's now going to be stuck in your head today. You're welcome. Before we moved away from the gold standard fully, the federal government with Fort Knox had to be sure that we could transfer all the dollars in the United States into gold if we needed to. Mm-hmm. That's because we had the gold standard. This is actually what The Wizard of Oz was a commentary about, was the move from the 1890s with the silver standard over to the gold standard. That's why there's a
Yellow
Brick Road and the Tin Man and silver and all this.
No one behind the curtain.
No one's behind the curtain. You can't go with gold. So anyway, that's a side point, but actually helps you understand the Book of Revelation in that same genre sometime if you ever want to go on a deep dive about the Wizard of Oz relationship to federal currency and the Book of Revelation in relationship
to... The Book of
Revelations
is about the gold standard.
It's actually, it's about modern monetary theory, if you really take it apart, right? And how Gog and Magog is actually Donald Trump and Mar-a-Lago. But we digress. But up until 1971, there was this idea that our federal dollars had to be backed by something. Then we made a decision in this country to have a fiat currency or a standalone currency, referencing nothing other than itself. That established a different way of spending. The reason we did that in the government is because we realized we're going to spend more money as a country than there is gold. You can't do that. You have to go this extra. You have to have the ability to generate money ex nihilo, out of nothing, which is what the Federal Reserve is able to do. And then uses banks, gives banks charters, and chartered banks then are the dispensaries of the money created by the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve gives money to banks for them to then lend out to people. They're the dispensary sides of that. So that's what it means to have a bank charter, which is why if you're watching Billions, you know how important it is for Bobby Axelrod to get a bank charter if you're into that television show. So anyway, that's what's going on here. And this point that she's trying to make, that the fiat currency is essential to it all, is going to come up over and over and over again if I finally let her continue on, as I will now.
Way of thinking, most of us probably carry a version of the tabs model in our minds, even if we have never spent a moment of our time thinking about the inner workings of the federal budget. We probably believe that the government needs our money to help pay the bills. We might even feel a bit patriotic about the check we send off to the Internal Revenue Service every April, proud to have done our small part in building low-income housing, paying our men and women in uniform, and supporting our farmers with generous subsidies. I hate to be the bearer of uncomfortable news, but that's not what's actually happening. If you're not already doing so, you should probably sit down. Are you ready? Your taxes don't actually pay for anything, at least not at the federal level. The government doesn't need our money. We need their money. We've got the whole thing backward. When I first encountered this way of understanding how taxing and spending work in actual practice, I recoiled. It was 1997, and I was midway through a PhD program in economics when someone shared a little book called Soft Currency Economics with me. The book's author, Warren Mosler, was a successful Wall Street investor, not an economist, and his book was about how the economics profession was getting almost everything wrong. I read it, and I wasn't convinced. According to Mosler, the government spends first, and then taxes or borrows. That sequencing turns Thatcher's dictum completely around, reordering the mnemonic to give us STAB, spending before taxing and borrowing. By Mosler's reasoning, the government doesn't go around looking for someone else to pick up the tab. It just spends its currency into existence. Warren saw things that most economists were missing. To many of us, his ideas initially sounded completely original, but most weren't. They were only new to us. It turns out they could be found, and we found them, in canonical texts, like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, or in John Maynard Keynes's 2-volume classic, A Treatise on Money. Anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, and others had long ago arrived at similar conclusions about the nature of money and the role of taxes, but the economics profession had largely lagged behind. Mosler is considered the father of MMT because he brought these ideas to a handful of us in the 1990s. He says he doesn't know how he came up with this way of understanding taxing and government spending, but that it just struck him after his years of experience working in financial markets. He was used to thinking in terms of debits and credits because he had been trading financial instruments and watching funds transfer between bank accounts. One day, he started to think about where all those dollars must have originally come from. It occurred to him that before the government could subtract, debit, any dollars away from us, it must first add, credit them. He reasoned that spending must have come first. Otherwise, where would anyone have gotten the dollars they needed to pay the tax? Although the logic seemed infallible, I felt certain his story couldn't be right. How could it? It turned everything I thought I understood about money, taxes, and government spending on its head. I had studied economics with world-renowned economists at Cambridge University, and none of my professors had ever said anything like this. In fact, all of the models they taught me were compatible with Thatcher's dictum that governments must tax or borrow before they can spend. Was it really possible that nearly everyone had it wrong? I had to find out. In 1998, I visited Mosler at his home in West Palm Beach, Florida, where I spent hours listening to him explain his thinking. He began by referring to the US dollar as a simple public monopoly. Since the US government is the sole source of dollars, it was silly to think of Uncle Sam as needing to get dollars from the rest of us. Obviously, the issuer of the dollar can have all the dollars it could possibly want. The government doesn't want dollars, Mosler explained. It wants something else. What does it want? I asked. It wants to provision itself, he replied. The tax isn't there to raise money. It's there to get people working and producing things for the government.
Okay, this idea, the reason there are taxes, the function of taxes is not to get money for the federal government. It's to cause human behavior. This is what's essential. The people I actually now remember first hearing all of this from were Republicans, funny enough, who would say the reason we have to get rid of our taxes is because taxes are fundamentally about trying to control human behavior in our economy. And it's not the government's business. The government shouldn't be rewarding some people and penalizing others. Like taxes are reward and punishment systems. We should get rid of taxes. The anti-tax, low tax, no tax crowd actually understands how the federal government works. They just don't ever tell you that, right? They then just bring up like, well, we're going to have deficits and go broke when it's Democrat agenda ideas, and they increase spending when it's Republican ideas. It's just sort of what has gone on. But this idea that the federal government uses taxes for two things: control inflation, she'll talk about that in a minute, but first is to control behavior, has to create a demand so that there's enough fuel in the economy for people to be sharing. This is where it gets can feel a little bit complicated and seem like the metaphor that Mosley's about to use here that she recounts seems a little simplistic, but I've listened to this a number of times, and I think it actually really, really does work, that you begin to understand, oh yeah, this is what's happening and why we need to have taxes so that the economy has some levers that the federal government can utilize to make certain things happen.
Yeah, I think Brian's getting at that in the comments. He says, is tax, that is removing money from the system, the methodology that keeps the value of the dollar controlled. Without removing money from the system, the Fed's creation of more money would drive up inflation and reduce the value of the dollar. I think that's kind of getting at it. This is one of the levers that controls, in theory, inflation.
Absolutely. I think Brian just, maybe if he hasn't listened to chapter 2 of the book yet, he has summarized it right there. She actually gives 3 or 4 reasons why we should have taxes. Only one of them makes any sense to me, which is this one. I barely even believe in the government has to try to manipulate people's behavior. And the idea that we're going to redistribute money from the wealthiest people so they don't have political power anymore just is functionally not possible. If you tax somebody at 30%, but they have 90% of the wealth, they still have 90% of the wealth. Yeah. Like you can't tax enough to get the super wealthy to not have a disproportionate amount of control. They keep bringing this one up. It's a big thing for people who hold to this theory. And I just think it's too small of an amount that to actually make that work. If it was a 90% tax, which we used to have in the 1920s and 30s, that might do the trick. But we're nowhere near that, and no one's even advocating that, right? Because we don't want to pull all that money out of the economy. Yeah, but Brian's right. It's that's what we're trying to do is prevent inflation. But here she gives this nice little illustration about how the federal government works as a fiat by this thing that Mosley did with his own children. So here we go.
Kinds of things, I asked. A military, a court system, public parks, hospitals, roads, bridges, that kind of stuff. To get the population to do all that work, the government imposes taxes, fees, fines, or other obligations. The tax is there to create demand for the government's currency. Before anyone can pay the tax, Someone has to do the work to earn the currency. My head spun. Then he told me a story. Mosler had a beautiful beachfront property with a swimming pool and all the luxuries of life anyone could hope to enjoy. He also had a family that included 2 young kids. To illustrate his point, he told me a story about the time he sat his kids down and told them he wanted them to do their part to keep the place clean and habitable. He wanted the yard mowed, beds made, dishes done, cars washed, and so on. To compensate them for their time, he offered to pay them for their labor. 3 of his business cards if they made their beds, 5 for doing the dishes, 10 for washing a car, and 25 for tending to the yard work. Days turned into weeks, and the house became increasingly uninhabitable. The grass grew knee-high, dishes piled up in the sink, and the cars were covered in sand and salt from the ocean breeze. "Why aren't you doing any work?" Mosler asked the kids. "I told you I would pay you some of my business cards to pitch in around here." "Dad," the kids intoned, "why would we work for your business cards? They're not worth anything." That's when Mosler had his epiphany. The kids hadn't done any chores because they didn't need his cards. So he told the kids he wasn't requiring them to do any work at all. All he wanted was a payment of 30 of his business cards each month. Failure to pay would result in a loss of privileges. No more TV, use of the swimming pool, or trips to the mall. It was a stroke of genius. Mosler had imposed a tax that could only be paid using his own monographed paper. Now, the cards were worth something. Within hours, the kids were scurrying around, tidying up their bedrooms, the kitchen, and the yard. What was once considered a worthless rectangular calling card was suddenly perceived as a valuable token. But why? How did Mosler get the kids to do all that work without forcing them to do any chores? Simple. He put them in a situation where they needed to earn his currency to stay out of trouble. Each time the kids did some work, they got a receipt, some business cards, for the task they had performed. At the end of the month, the kids returned the cards to their father. As Mosler explained, he didn't actually need to collect his own cards back from the kids. "What would I want with my own tokens?" he asked. He had already gotten what he really wanted out of the deal, a tidy house. So why did he bother taxing the cards away from the kids? Why didn't he let them hold on to them as souvenirs? The reason was simple. Mosler collected the cards so the kids would need to earn them again next month. He had invented a virtuous provisioning system. Virtuous in this case means that it keeps repeating. Mosler used this story to illustrate some basic principles about the way sovereign currency issuers actually fund themselves. Taxes are there to create a demand for government currency. The government can define the currency in terms of its own unique unit of account, a dollar, a yen, a pound, a peso, and then give value to its own otherwise worthless paper by requiring it in payment of taxes or other obligations. As Mosler jokes, taxes turn litter into currency. At the end of the day, a currency-issuing government wants something real, not something monetary. It's not our tax money the government wants. It's our time. To get us to produce things for the state, the government invents taxes or other kinds of payment obligations. This isn't the explanation you'll find in most economics textbooks, where a superficial story about money being invented to overcome the inefficiencies associated with bartering, trading goods without the use of money, is preferred.
So this is why you hear Republicans, or libertarians even more so, who understand how the federal system works with a fiat currency, will say that taxation is tyranny. Because what they're arguing is when the government taxes us, they're doing it to make us work for the government. They're putting the government at the center of things. By demanding that everything be paid in US dollars means we have to function in that system, and they keep removing money to make people have to keep being connected to and beholden to the federal government. This is why taxes and small government end up being wed together and welded together, not because they want there to be less taxes so the government has less money to spend. They want less taxes so the government has less demand to make you do the proverbial chores, to be in service of the government. If you're a libertarian and you're listening to this, I mean, your mind would be You'd be furious,
This
right?
is also an example of a case where people on the far left and the far right, if you keep going far enough, you come back together on the other side of the world, and you find yourself both mad that there's taxes.
Both mad that there's taxes because they there's a view of the role of government, and ultimately that's where all this is leading to, is what should be the preferred role of the government. And when you hear her say, well, the reason that the government's going to have taxes is so that we all stay performing for the government, so we have these things, it's like, whoa, hang on a minute. Why don't you just put a whole bunch of money in and just keep putting money in, and only take money out if there's too much in there, and find some. I mean, I honestly have this question for all the people who understand this. I'm going to ask Professor Kaboub or Stephanie Kelton when I have a chance. Why not just find another mechanism to remove money and slow down inflation? Like, why don't we do that? Because all of this personal pressure, it's really quite irritating. Like, now that I know that when I have to pay federal taxes, federal income tax, it's like that money is just like, that's just so we don't have inflation. That's crazy talk. Like, we already have a system now. Everybody's using the economy. We're using the dollar in our economy. There's no chance we're not going to do that. Is this really the best way to limit the money in the system, is to take it from me? So I think there's some real questions that are raised here, which is no different than the question that was raised when I would think, like, so the $1,500 you're taking from me, you're going to make that a part of the $1 trillion you're spending? Like, really? You need mine? It makes somebody think cheating on your taxes isn't such a bad idea, right? When you start to really do the math. And so we've ended up with, like, paying taxes as some law or some civic duty that we have, instead of talking about this in ways that make a whole lot more sense to people about why we're doing this. And I just wish we would have these debates at the public level, and senators and congresspeople and others would have this conversation. I wish Joe Manchin would just say, I don't want to spend $2 trillion because I think that's putting too much in the economy without taking some out, and the pool is going to be over full. Instead of, like, I need a CBO rating that tells me if this, like, oh my goodness, without the essential explanation of why you're protesting something. All right, so she goes on. Should we keep going? Another minute or two?
Keep going, yeah.
20?
Story. Money is just a convenient device that sprang up organically as a way to make trade more efficient.
I should say what she's doing here, and I interrupted her. She's saying this is why taxes. This is why we actually have them. Our currency is so that there'll be a system. She's saying what we're told in economics was that a barter system was replaced by a dollar system, and she's basically going to say that never existed. We never bartered. We always only did this. That's what she's doing. But I interrupted with my editorial there. So.
Students are taught that barter was once omnipresent, a sort of natural state of being. Scholars of the ancient world have found little evidence that societies were ever organized around barter exchange. MMT rejects the ahistorical barter narrative, drawing instead on an extensive body of scholarship known as chartalism, which shows that taxes were the vehicle that allowed ancient rulers and early nation-states to introduce their own currencies, which only later circulated as a medium of exchange among private individuals. From inception, the tax liability creates people looking for paid work, also known as unemployment, in the government's currency. The government, or other authority, then spends its currency into existence, giving people access to the tokens they need to settle their obligations to the state. Obviously, no one can pay the tax until the government first supplies its tokens. As a simple point of logic, Mosler explained that most of us had the sequencing wrong. Taxpayers weren't funding the government. The government was funding the taxpayers. It started to make sense to me, at least in theory. I began to think of the government as the currency monopolist. Mosler's argument brought back childhood memories, in this case, playing the board game Monopoly with my family when I was just a kid. As I thought about the rules of the game, I began to see the parallels even more clearly. For one thing, the game can't begin until someone is put in control of the currency. The players don't pony up the money to get the game underway. They can't because they don't have it yet. the currency has to be issued before anyone can get it. After the initial dispensation, the players move around the board, buying property, paying rent, landing in jail, or drawing a card that instructs them to pay $50 to the IRS. Each time a player rounds the board, they receive a $200 payment from the person who controls the currency. Because the players are merely users of the currency, they can and do go broke. The issuer, however, can never run out of money. In fact, the official rules of the game literally read, "The bank never goes broke. If the bank runs out of money, the banker may issue as much more money as may be needed by writing on any ordinary paper." I thought about this idea of writing on paper to make money when I took my own kids on a tour of the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C. If you haven't done it, I highly recommend it. It's eye-opening. You can schedule a tour on the government's own website, www.moneyfactory.gov. It's a far more sophisticated operation than making monopoly money by writing on any ordinary paper, but it amounts to much the same thing. It's one of the places where the issuer of our currency manufactures it. One of the first things I noticed was an enormous neon sign suspended high above the engraving equipment. The sign read, "We make money the old-fashioned way. We print it." Everyone wanted to take a picture of it, but photos aren't permitted on the tour. The crowd marveled at the sight as reams of uncut 10s, 20s, and $100 bills spun from the machines. Then someone said what we were all thinking. I wish I could do that. Alas, to avoid the orange jumpsuits, we need to leave the manufacturing to the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Those notes make up part of the supply of U.S. currency. As those old mason jars full of pennies, nickels, and dimes on your grandmother's shelf attest, the government also issues U.S. currency in the form of coins. Just as the Federal Reserve describes itself as the issuing authority for all Federal Reserve notes, the U.S. Mint describes itself as the nation's sole manufacturer of legal tender coinage. Finally, the Federal Reserve issues digital dollars, known as bank reserves. These are created exclusively via keystrokes on a computer controlled by the government's fiscal agent, the Federal Reserve. When the Wall Street banks needed trillions of dollars to survive the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed effortlessly conjured them into existence using nothing more than a keyboard at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. To the average person, it might seem as though the government literally takes the bills rolling off its printing press or coins tumbling from its minting machines to pay its bills. Cable news shows certainly love the imagery of the mass production of money. They'll often air a story about government spending while running a video of newly manufactured dollars spewing from the printing press. But Federal Reserve notes and coins are mostly there for our convenience. It would be way too clunky for the federal government to pay Boeing for a fleet of new fighter jets with an enormous stockpile of physical currency. That's just not how it works. Instead of handing over fistfuls of cash, as in Monopoly, the federal government makes most of its payments the way a scorekeeper assigns points in a game of bridge. Except, instead of writing the points on a scorecard, payments simply get typed into a computer by someone at the Federal Reserve. Let me explain. Take military spending. In 2019, the House and Senate passed legislation that increased the military budget, approving $716 billion, nearly $80 billion more than Congress had authorized in fiscal year 2018. There was no debate about how to pay for the spending. No one asked, where will we get the extra $80 billion? Lawmakers didn't raise taxes or go out and borrow an extra $80 billion from savers so that the government could afford to make the additional payments. Instead, Congress committed to spending money it did not have. It can do that because of its special power over the U.S. dollar. Once Congress authorizes the spending, agencies like the Department of Defense are given permission to enter into contracts with companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and so on. To provision itself with F-35 fighters, the U.S. Treasury instructs its bank, the Federal Reserve, to carry out the payment on its behalf. The Fed does this by marking up the numbers in Lockheed's bank account. Congress doesn't need to find the money to spend it. It needs to find the votes. Once it has the votes, it can authorize the spending. The rest is just accounting. As the checks go out, the Federal Reserve clears the payments by crediting the seller's account with the appropriate number of digital dollars, known as bank reserves. That's why MMT sometimes describes the Fed as the scorekeeper for the dollar. The scorekeeper can't run out of points. Think about where the points come from when you play a card game or go to a basketball game. They don't come from anywhere. They're just conjured into existence by the person doing the record keeping. When a basketball player drains a shot from behind the three-point line, 3 points are added to the team's total. Does the scorekeeper reach into a bucket to get those 3 points? Of course not. The scorekeeper doesn't actually have any points. To record the 3-point shot, the scorekeeper simply changes the numbers up, and the bigger number lights up on the scoreboard. Now suppose the play gets reviewed, and the referees determine that the shot clock had run out. The points are taken away, but note that the arena doesn't actually collect anything back. It's just adding and subtracting points, the same way the federal government adds and subtracts dollars from the economy when it spends and taxes. Uncle Sam doesn't.
I mean, right there it is. It just takes it away and it just goes to nowhere. That is something else. So when you pay your taxes, what you're doing is creating room for more government spending on other things than what you would spend it on, so that inflation and other issues are not impacted.
And the funny thing is this, like, hey, money doesn't grow on trees. We don't have a magic money tree. It's like, no, that's way too much work. We have a keyboard, and we can literally just move a decimal and create billions of dollars.
The technical word for that is quantitative easing, where they ease the quantity, the demand for quantity. That's where all these little phrases come from. So no, it doesn't grow on trees or in cotton fields. It just is, just a basic little tap, 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 tap. There you go. And the money exists.
Yeah.
It's really something. So this is where, again, you'll hear people, Republicans, say things like, you know better how to spend your money than the government, because they understand, many of them who use that argument, rather than you spending the money in the system, the government takes your money away and then puts new money in. So there's now no more or less money, right? An even swap when taxes equal the amount, or maybe they'll put in more money if spending is greater than taxes. There's also borrowing, which comes in there, which is, she's going to get to that in a minute. But that exchange, then the government says, we're going to spend money on this bridge rather than you spending it on a fancy ring light for your radio show, right? That's a thing that they're doing. This is why they'll say, and this is what's confusing about libertarians and Republicans. On one hand, they'll say all this stuff, the government's tyranny when it takes your taxes, you know how to spend your money better than the government knows how to spend your money. But then they'll say, we don't have any money that doesn't come from you. They're only right on one half of this thing, and then Democrats and progressives are right on only one half of this thing. So if we could get together and be right on both halves of this thing, we could really have a different conversation about how we should function as a society. Yeah. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. What do you think, Dan? You kind of got it. I'd encourage you to. There's 27 minutes left in that chapter, by the way. So there's still a lot more to go. That is versions of the same theme. The thing she does get into, and we can deal with it in coming weeks, is the issue of inflation. Then she does a thing on borrowing or deficits, and why deficits are actually a crucially important thing. Because when we don't have any deficit, means we've taken out as much money as the government has put in. Well, that's a bad thing, right? Because then deficits don't mean the money the government owes. It's the difference between the amount that's come out and the amount that's gone in. Because they're not borrowing money. They're not going to China and getting Chinese yen and then bringing it to the U.S. They're just moving their own money around. What they mean by borrowing is they're going to say, hey, instead of us taking some money out of the economy right now and in taxes, how about if we say that if we take your money out now, we'll give you $1 out now, we'll give you $1.10 10 years from now. That difference right there, that 10-cent difference, that's what they call the deficit. So that's all that it is. And there's no problem because the government could just pay off its debts anytime it wants just by saying, okay, nobody owes anything anymore. I mean,
which is frustrating about the student loan promise that Biden made. Because literally all he has to do is say, yeah, we're forgiving all these federal loans.
When, maybe you remember during the Obama administration, I can't remember his first term or second term, they moved all federally backed student loans because there used to be private companies that, like mortgage companies, gave loans. So when I went to college, I got my loans and paid my loans back to a private entities who were backed by the federal government. What the Obama administration did, preparing for the time that we're in now, was to move the money away from those private entities, bought them out. So we're no longer going to back you. We're just going to, you'll actually take the loan from the federal government so that the federal government could just eliminate the loans without somebody's business being making money off of it, right? Mm-hmm. They were getting ready for this. They were preparing. It takes 10, 20 years to get ready for this. Now's the time to do it. Student loan would be a great thing. And the fairness argument is real. Like, I had to pay back all my student loans. So if you don't, then it's kind of like, well, how does that work? Well, solve that with a tax credit, right? Go back and find the loans that I paid, and I get that money back in a tax credit of some variety, right? So there's a way to get to all of this stuff because there's enough money to do whatever we want to do.
Yeah.
That's the point. Now, there's not enough money to do every single thing because that would cause inflation. And that's a real concern right now. You know, the federal government spent $2 trillion or $4 trillion for COVID, just pumped the money into the economy, like literally into bank accounts, you know, and forgivable loans and all this stuff, just pumped it in. That's what a lot of us have been living off of. And that's kept the economy afloat. But now when the economy comes back, it's going to be like, oh, now is there too much money, which then causes the price of things to go up.
Right. And not just too much money, but too much money in the wrong places. So the reason for inflation isn't just that people have too much money to spend. It's that the capacity to produce the goods that we want to buy has been limited. And that's why prices go up. That's why inflation happens.
That's right.
If the government had also pumped money into the supply chain to make sure that there's enough dishwashers and whatever people want to buy with their stimulus money.
Enough productivity.
Yeah.
Or say tests. Let's just use COVID tests. It's just a little example. Also produced it up. Hey, just on a side note, did you hear that Florida, now it's come out that they had some hundreds of thousands of tests? And they were mocking the woman running for governor, DeSantis, in the crowd there, the Republicans, because she said there's a bunch of tests, hundreds of thousands of tests that are going to expire. And they're like, what are you talking about? You don't know anything. Turns out, yep, they are.
Just a warehouse full of unusable tests.
Yeah, because they said nobody wanted them.
That part I might believe from Florida. But
it's like you keep stuff in your basement. You don't tell anyone you have stuff in your basement. And then you say, I'm just going to throw it away because nobody wants it. Like, they just hid these things away. No one knew they existed or should be asking about them. Then they're like, well, nobody asked for them. Like, that's just wacky.
Yep.
It's something else. And that's where this economy conversation is broader. It's really not about, and this isn't even macroeconomics we're talking about. This is really just federal spending and federal taxation and some of the rest. But it's what impacts a lot of people's understanding of the function and role of the federal government. So.
Yeah, thanks to everybody in the chat. Thanks, Brian. He says, great topic. Rachel says, so eye-opening. Thanks, I'm getting the book. That's great.
All right.
The book is called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. And I got to get a copy too.
Yes. Thanks, Kesh and Allie. Hey, one of the things, if you don't like to buy things and support your local a bookstore or writer, there's an organization that says free distribution of copyrighted material. It's called the Public Library. So if you think, well, I don't want to spend X amount of dollars on the audiobook, you can get them from your public library. It's a real thing.
You can get the audiobook from your public library.
Yes, isn't that something?
Yeah.
And it's interesting what public libraries do with digital resources, whether they're digital books or audiobooks. They don't actually have a limit on how many of those there are, right? They're digital.
But they impose a limit. Like, I'm on a waiting list for several books.
Digital books.
Digital, yeah.
Because, and this is exactly what the economy is. Like, you could get on a waiting list for the deficit myth to understand how the library creates an economic system. It determines how many books, with a contract deal with the publisher, how many books it will lend out, even though they're digital, not because there's not enough books, but because they don't want to devalue and have too many books out there in the world. They're trying to keep the value of the books not flooded, inflation, not or deflation, not flooding the market with them, because then there would be too many of these books. So that's the very thing, right? It's that just once you believe and know and understand that currency is actually a digital commodity, not a physical thing, which still is hard for people to grasp, right? You know, it's that old credit card thing when you were a kid and you're like, I don't know, I get my mom's credit card. I just give them the card and they give you all this stuff. Like there's no, you know, like, yeah, but somewhere there's a bank and they keep track of things. In fact, I got to drive to the bank here today and put some money in because there's a thing happening. You know, like that's a thing that we actually do because you're just trying to keep your ledger up to balance, not because you're moving things around. There's no limit of books. There's no limit of dollars or anything else. It's just how many do you have access to and how many do other people have access to.
Yep.
Fascinating. And, you know, once you realize that some of these old caught up narratives of argument that you're like, I don't even know, like, why can we not come to agreement on this as a country? And then you realize, oh, it's because people are operating in fundamentally different stories. Like there's different kinds of arguments. There's arguments where people agree upon the same story and there's two ways this can go. Then there's arguments where people are really in two different stories. Mm-hmm. A lot of personal conflict that people have is because they're actually arguing about two randomly different things. I remember one time I was talking to, I think I can share all this. Grace McLaren is a friend of Shelley and mine, and Shelley and I were vacationing with Brian and Grace, and I was bickering as I tend to do about Shelley's water bottle, this orange metal water bottle that has dented bottom so it doesn't stand up and it's always falling over and it's too tall and those water bottles are just wrongly shaped and they're falling over and they make noise and I'm always like, we're going to play tennis and she's like, well, I got to get a different water bottle because mine's going to fall over, it won't fit on the bike or something. I'm like, yeah, that water bottle, like why it doesn't make any sense. We get back and Grace gets into this with us. She's like a therapist type, person on this, and she goes, hey, here's what's happening. You're thinking about the water bottle in its proficiency and its effectiveness. Shelley has an emotional connection to the water bottle. You're talking about two totally different things. Yeah. Very helpful. We have two different stories about what the meaning and function and reasonableness of a water bottle is. That happens all across the political debates and social and civic debates, that we just end up in having radically different conversations about what's actually going on. So, yep. All right. Well, hey, we will be back Monday, and we're going to have somebody on Monday for a little short bit I talked to her today. She is 43 days into a hunger fast. Gosh. Calling attention around voting rights. She's a 73-year-old woman doing what she can. It's just a great little newsy story. So Sherry's going to be on Monday. We're going to hear about that. And so if you're looking for a great weight loss effort, it's always available.
All right. We'll see you all Monday.
All right. We'll see you all